Hi everyone, this video is about sharpening, which was a topic quite a few people requested on YouTube in the comments. So if you do have a topic you'd like me to discuss in future, then please do comment away and I'll do my best to follow up. But before we get started on sharpening, I do have a quick announcement to make, and that's about the Natural Landscape Photography Awards. So this is a new international competition that I've set up with 3 other photographers that aims to both award and promote photographers who work in a more traditional eyewitness style with their landscape photography. So we've basically tried to create the kind of competition that we would want to enter ourselves, and that's one that awards that natural processing style. So there are a lot of competitions out there already, and some of the bigger international competitions have tended to award images that are increasingly fantastical, that rely very heavily on Photoshop. And if you're a person who likes to stay true to the original scene, which is something I'm passionate about, then it can be very difficult to compete in those competitions. So that's the general background for us creating the awards. But there's lots of other exciting aspects to this competition. The first is that we have a pretty incredible judging panel. We've mixed experience with trailblazers, so we've got some new and exciting photographers who are really setting modern standards for photography, but we've also got some of the old masters who've proven themselves to be some of the greatest photographers in the world. So we're really privileged to have this amazing judging panel. And aside from that, we've created a judging process that we think will produce better results than some other competitions have done in the past. And we've also created some categories that might be interesting, that are a little bit novel. So one of them is the intimate category. So that's for landscapes focused on smaller details, abstract scenes, telephoto shots, that sort of thing. So images that are really abstracted from the landscape and maybe introduce some meaning in that way. And we also have a project award, which aims to award a portfolio of work, so 6 images together that are shown together as opposed to just single images. And aside from that, we do have the top award, which will be awarded to the photographer who produces the best 6 standalone images, so they could be in all different categories. And the top prize for that is $5,000. So we do have lots of other prizes as well. And you can check out all of the entry fees and information and so on the website, which is at the bottom here, so you can go and check it out for yourself. But that's the Natural Landscape Photography Awards. So now on to sharpening, and this video is about the process of sharpening an image as opposed to capturing sharp images in the first place. So we're going to assume that you've done that side of things, but I will produce a video in future when I can actually get out and about with my camera showing you how to achieve sharp results. So sharpening is really a means of creating crisp edges, and it also increases the appearance of detail. So detail and sharpening are actually technically separate things, and people can really be nitpicky about that sort of thing. But in practical terms, sharpening increases the appearance of detail, and I can understand why people confuse the two and mix them up because they're so closely interlinked. So importantly with sharpening, there are 2 different aspects to it. There's input capture sharpening, which is the first sharpening process that we'll apply. And then there's output sharpening, which is a sharpening method that's tuned to your output media, which really is split down 2 threads itself. And that's web output and print output. So if you're sharpening for web, you'll take a very different approach to if you're sharpening for a large print, for example. And that print sharpening can actually be a really complex subject in itself. My process is relatively simple, to be honest, but I am just going to touch on the thought process behind print sharpening and a basic method for it, but not go into it in depth, because you could just create 10 videos purely on that if you really wanted to. It's a bit too complex. And I think it's much better to focus on that web sharpening side, because I suspect you're like me in that the majority of your images are generally seen on the web. That's how people would view them as opposed to prints on the wall. So we're going to focus on that web sharpening side. But I'm also going to give you a background understanding of why we need to do this input sharpening and what sharpening actually is, because I think having that foundational understanding is really useful, because when new sharpening techniques come along and so on, you can actually understand what's going on there. So without me waffling on anymore, let's get started. So first up, we're going to discuss capture sharpening, which is essentially a means of recovering the sharpness that is lost during the capture process due to the image sensor itself. So even if we had absolutely perfect capture technique and perfect optics, we would still end up with an image that was very slightly soft. And that's because of the sensor design itself. So all cameras will suffer from this, but the vast majority have a sensor design known as a Bayer array, and every pixel either captures red, green or blue. It doesn't capture in full color. So we have to take that single color pixel and turn it into a full color pixel. And you do that by a process called demosaicing, where you're basically looking at the colors and intensities of the pixels surrounding the one that you want to turn into a full color pixel. It's a bit of matrix maths that you really don't want to learn about. It's not necessary at all to understand that for photography, but you do need to understand that you can never get a perfectly sharp image if you've got one of these cameras, which everybody does. So you need to do a degree of capture sharpening, and some people would also use capture sharpening to recover softness introduced by poor technique, although personally I would do that at a later stage. And for that reason, I don't actually touch this detail slider in Lightroom very often at all. In fact, I would say 99% of my images, I leave this completely untouched, because these settings are pretty well tuned for landscape photography, where we're shooting at low ISOs, and we're really just trying to recover that softness introduced by the sensor. So these are the settings that you will have if you install Lightroom by default, and unless you save them as some sort of import preset, change them as an import preset, they will be applied to every one of your images. So if I zoom into 200% here so that you can see a little better if you're on a normal high definition monitor, because I'm on a 4K monitor here, then you should see that these edges are well defined and they have no artifacts, they have no halos, and that's the key aspect of capture sharpening, that we're not introducing any problems that we could exaggerate at a later stage when we do our output sharpening. So everything is very well defined here, but there are no artifacts. And if we zoom in to a much greater amount, let's do 800%, you can see the pixels here, and this edge exists across about 4 or 5 pixels width. An absolutely perfect edge would exist over 1 pixel, but you really don't need to, or two pixels really, but you really don't need to worry about that. If the edge looks good and crisp, then it is. And at this stage, we're not going to apply masses of sharpening to the point that every edge is perfectly defined. It's just not necessary at this stage, and we don't want to give ourselves a harder job later on. However, some of you will be using Lightroom as an output mechanism for printing, so printing directly from Lightroom. And if you are, then you may need to use this panel to a greater extent. For everybody who's printing from Photoshop or other programs, you really just want to use these default settings because that's our capture sharpening pretty much sorted. But if you're going to print directly from Lightroom, then you may want to have a play around with this panel to understand exactly what it does. But if you're just looking to achieve a nice sharp print, in most cases it's sufficient to simply over sharpen your image to a reasonable degree so that the details don't look terrible, but they look over sharpened, because you're going to lose some of that sharpness again when you print the image. And this is just a good basis to start your printing journey and have a bit of an experiment with what you like in the sharpness of your own prints. So these sliders, just to go through them very quickly, the amount is obviously the degree of sharpening that is applied. The radius is the radius over which an edge is sharpened. So if we zoom in to say 800% again, you can see that this edge is quite thick. In fact, it's 3 pixels thick either side of the edge itself. That's the size of the halo that this radius setting has control over here. So that's the radius tool, but I would suggest keeping that at 1 unless you know what you're doing with your print sharpening. And then let's zoom back out to 200% again quickly. Then we've got our detail setting, which is going to enhance the sharpening of finer, softer details within the image. I would suggest that you essentially never want to touch that one because in my experience, it never looks good. I find it a bit of a strange setting in Lightroom, to be honest. But maybe there's an application here or there for it, but I wouldn't recommend using that one. And finally, masking, which is going to stop sharpening from being applied to softer edges, so edges that have less definition in the first place. So if you watch the sort of flatter areas of the image as I move this, you can see now at this point, this very harsh edge here is being sharpened, but anywhere else is actually quite soft. So there's no sharpening in this area at all, for example, because there isn't enough edge contrast in here. So we've masked that out, so to speak. So that's what those settings do. But honestly, I wouldn't play around with them unless you're printing directly from Lightroom. So next up, we're going to talk about exporting for web. So let's say we're now perfectly happy with how this image looks. We've just done our capture sharpening. We've not done any more than that. So the edge looks crisp, but there's no artifacts there. And now we want to export a lower resolution file for a website or social media. So I'm going to take you through two approaches to doing that. One is in Lightroom and the other in Photoshop. So let's start with Lightroom, and all we have to do is select File and Export. And then we're going to decide where we're going to save the image, and we're going to rename it if we want to. You don't have to. And then you're going to set the image format to JPEG because that's just the standard for web display. And then you're going to set a quality that doesn't ruin the image, but compresses it sufficiently that it's going to load fast, because in my opinion it's better to have an image that loads quickly so people see it on slow connections rather than one that looks absolutely perfect. And if you choose a setting that's say between 65 and 70, then to be honest the quality is so high that people just aren't going to see compression artifacts at all. And if you post to social media like Facebook, it's going to recompress anyway, so you really don't need to worry about that too much. So the color space, I'd recommend sRGB, especially for web export, because most people are not going to have wide color space monitors, and sRGB is the standard for the web. I think you'd be a pretty brave photographer to choose anything else for this setting. So that's all very straightforward. And then finally, you want to resize the image. When I'm exporting for my website, I tend to use these settings here. So I never want a portrait image to be taller than 1000 pixels because people's screens are not as tall as they are wide. And 1600 pixels is my limit for normal landscape frames. For panoramas, I'll go a little wider than that. So that will automatically resize the image. And finally, all we have to do is sharpen the image for screen display. And using the screen setting and amount standard and selecting export is actually going to produce a very good result. So let's just do that. So here's the image that we just exported at 1000 pixels high, which is why it looks tiny on my 4K screen. But I've just opened it in Photoshop so that we can zoom in and out easily, so I can show you the detail that exists in the file and what the edges look like. So if we zoom in massively here, you will start to see a little bit of compression artifacts here and there, but that's never going to be visible at the full view of the image. And if we just focus on this edge here, you can see that on the inside of the edge, it's brighter than the tone of the snow. And then on the other side, it's a little bit darker, although it's a little bit difficult to make that out against the pattern that's going on behind. But basically, this edge is slightly over sharp compared to a perfect edge. But when we look at it at a normal size, then that over sharpening completely disappears and the image just ends up looking incredibly crisp. So actually Lightroom's default settings, they're very quick to use. You can export a lot of images at once and they actually produce really good results. And you have to be quite a picky photographer to want to do more than that. But of course, many people will want to do more than that. And that's what I'll go into in just a second. But if you're exporting a lot of images at once, then I would recommend just using this Lightroom process. It's very straightforward and it produces very good results. If you go through a finer process, which I'm about to show you, then you're going to lose some of that sharpening anyway when social media compresses your files and so on. So it's not all that it's cracked up to be, even if it is slightly better. But I use this method, this Lightroom export method, for the vast majority of photos that I end up going on my website and Instagram, simply because I'm doing so many at once. I'll do 30 at a time or something, and then in the case of Instagram, have an uploader automatically upload them for me to save a bit of time. So it's just much faster to use this simple Lightroom export process, and your images will look great. They won't look over sharp and they will look perfectly crisp. So this is this same image, but I've actually applied some edits now in Photoshop as I might normally, so you can see some adjustments here on the right. So my process that I actually use is to take photos from Lightroom into Photoshop to do some final adjustments. Then I'll save that file as a Photoshop document, a .psd file, and that's my master file. So still at this stage, we only have the capture sharpening applied. So if I just zoom in here, you can see that this looks exactly the same as it does in Lightroom, but we have these various adjustments. So here I've just corrected the highlights because they were slightly too bright, for example. So this is a file that I keep long term. It's exactly how all of my prints exist, all of my images, my portfolio images exist as these PSD files. And it's these that I will actually use to create the final web images and prints from. But if I really care about the sharpness of a web image, if I want it to be the very best it can possibly be, then I will come into Photoshop to produce that web image. I won't be using Lightroom, and I will actually sharpen using some actions. So I am going to take you through the Photoshop sharpening processes in just a second, but first off I'm going to do this sharpening for web. So this is an action that you can download from my website. I will put the link in the video description. It's completely free. In fact, I think I've put it on Dropbox, and you can figure out how to install this yourself. I can't remember the exact method, but there's lots of information online for how to install actions. And then you should be able to just open the actions palette and open this folder, this web resize folder, and find all of the settings that you see here. And this is just set up so that if you click the action of a 600 size, for example, it will make the image 600 on its longest edge. So in this case, we want to make this 1000 pixels high. So we're going to select the 1000 action here, and then we're just going to press play. And that goes through a multiple stage sharpening process, and obviously very significantly shrinks the image down. So you can see now that we have this beautifully sharp image. And because this goes through a two-step sharpening method, it actually does a really good job of making the edges as crisp as they possibly can be without introducing any unwanted artifacts. So this is a two-step sharpening process that's used by many professional photographers. There are some really great tools out there. There's one produced by Andreas Resch, which is a Photoshop plugin, so that you can have full control over this entire process. But there's actually a lot of professional photographers who use my action. It's actually been around for many years now, and it's just a very easy way of doing this web sharpening in Photoshop, because it tends to produce really good results really quickly, whereas with the more advanced panels and so on, you have to tune the settings to your liking and so on. Now, if you're familiar with Photoshop, I don't want to go into how Photoshop is used in this video, then you can change the opacity of these layers to change the amount of sharpening. So you can turn off the visibilities, or you can have 100% opacity, so that's really exceptionally sharp, but over sharp to my taste. Or you can have it to a much lower setting if you prefer a slightly softer look. So there's lots of control here, and you can even go in with the layer mask and focus on sharpening particular details. So I'm just going to demonstrate that very quickly here. So I'm going to actually put this to 100% opacity, this sharpness layer, the sharper layer, which is the sharpest layer there. And we're going to fill this this mask with black. And again, I can't really explain masks at this point, so apologies if you don't know what I'm doing. But it might be that you want to sharpen this area, the shadowed area, more than you do, for example, these already quite well defined lines here. So we're going to set the brush to 50% and just make sure that we do have some definition in those lines there. And I've somehow managed managed to link my mouse to the position of the image. There we go, that's fixed now. So we're just going to paint this area with a 50% opacity, and then we're going to go full 100% in this area here. And let's say we don't want to sharpen the background at all because we really want this ridge to stand out. So you can sort of locally paint in sharpness where you want it to appear, and that's roughly how this would work. So actually, I don't think we even had white there quite. So let's paint that 100% white in that area. So you can now see that the maximum sharpening will be applied to that shadowed area. So that's that layer turned on and off. And if you're really particular about how your images looked on the web, then you might care to do that for each image and make every section of the photo look its very best to get the optimal result. Personally, I think that's overkill, and people just aren't going to appreciate that level of work. But the option is there if you want to, and please do download these actions if you want to use them. So I've now reset the image to its full size, and we've got our edits back. So this again is my master PSD, so we can zoom in and we see lots of detail here again. So this is not the web resolution image, it's the full size image. And I'm going to very quickly show you the sharpening tools in Photoshop and how I personally would approach printing this image at a fairly large size. So there are two schools of thought on printing photos and sharpening for print. One is that you should sharpen based on both the print size and the intended viewing distance. So for example, if you were producing a small print that was intended to be viewed at a large distance, then you might sharpen to a very large radius, which I will do quickly now. So we're going to just select unsharp mask here. You'd sharpen to a very large radius, say I don't know, 5 pixels or something, and a sensible amount. So what we're trying to do is make halos appear almost everywhere, something like that. So it looks really terrible zoomed in. We've way over sharpened all these details. You can see there's apparent halos around every single edge that are really obvious when we zoom in. But if we're viewing this as a small print from a distance, then it's going to look something like this. And what you've actually done is increase the acutance, the definition of those edges at that specific print size and viewing distance. The problem is if you produce a really high quality print and you then decide that rather than viewing it from 6 feet away, you're going to put your eyeball up to the image, then you might start to see all of these halos again. So that brings us to the other school of thought on print sharpening, which is the one that I subscribe to, which is that you should sharpen so that the details, when you look at the print up close, look their very best. Because I love doing that with prints, with high resolution prints, because it's just really exciting to see all these fine details, to be able to put your eyes up to these waves in the snow and really enjoy the crispness and the way that the light glints off the ice crystals and so on. So I love having detailed prints that show the details at their very best. And what I almost always do when I'm actually exporting for web is I'll create a duplicate of the file. I will flatten it. So I'll go layer, flatten image, and that compresses all of the adjustments into a single layer. I'll duplicate the layer and then I will start sharpening. And in most cases, I will use the unsharpening mask, so the unsharp mask here. And this is actually an old technique based on film sharpening. So what you would do there is effectively project a softer version of the image over the print, and the difference between the two actually helps to define the edges, which you can read about online if you're curious about why it's called unsharp mask. It's very well explained in various places, but that's why it has this rather strange description. But it's a very simple tool to use, and it does a pretty similar thing to the Lightroom tools. So we've got the amount, which is obviously just the degree to which the sharpening is applied, and I'm going to set the radius to 1 pixel, which is generally a good basis to start with. And you can see that it's way over sharpened at this point, but it's good for explaining what the threshold does, because the threshold, a bit like that masking tool in Lightroom, stops the sharpening from being applied in very low contrast edge areas. So as I move this to the right, you can see that we are only sharpening the well-defined edges, not the finer details. Personally, I think you do want to sharpen the finer details a little bit as well, so I tend to keep this fairly low, usually around 3 or 4. And then I apply the amount to suit. And much like I discussed earlier, what you want to do to get this print sharp when you put your face up to it is really just over sharpen the edges a little bit so that you can start to see those halos appearing. So here you can see there is a very well-defined halo that's brighter on this side of the edge and darker on the other side. So when you view that print very close up, you may just be able to make out that halo, but it's not going to be objectionable, and all of the detail is going to look incredibly crisp. So this is usually where I would sharpen my images, and then if I've got a really complex job, then I start to go in with masking and layers and different sharpening degrees, because that's the power of using these layers. So that's why I made these adjustments onto a new layer. And if you're that way inclined, you could also use smart layers, but again, I'm not going to get into that here because I'm conscious that this video has already droned on a little bit too long. But I hope you've enjoyed that, and that's given you a good sense of sharpening. The two take-homes here for me are, firstly, you do your capture sharpening separately. It's a non-destructive way of sharpening. You're just trying to improve edge definition without making them look super crispy. Then there's a couple of ways that you can export for web, but that Lightroom export for web is a really good method for both resizing and sharpening your images in a very successful way that will always look good. And then if you want more control, then you can use my web sharpening action, or you can even go in and figure out your own process for doing that in Photoshop. And finally, for prints, it's a massive minefield of complexity, but I would suggest that my favorite method is certainly to slightly over sharpen on the pixel level so that your prints have really good fine detail when you put your eyes up to them. So hopefully you found that helpful, and please do like and subscribe.